This is Radio Caravan, the world news read by Shabnam Modgil. Democrats yesterday accused President Trump of trying to inflame racial tensions and incite violence to benefit his campaign as he praised supporters who clashed with protesters in Portland, Oregon, where a man died, and announced that he will travel to Kenosha, Wisconsin, amid anger over the shooting of another black man by police. Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden reacted to the violent clashes that took place Saturday night in Portland between anti-police brutality protesters and supporters of President Trump, calling it unacceptable. The mayor of Portland and President Trump engaged in a real-time argument yesterday as the president sent a flurry of critical tweets about Ted Wheeler as the mayor was holding a press conference about the fatal shooting of a right-wing supporter in his city the night before. After President Trump called Wheeler a Democrat, a fool, and blamed him for allowing violence to proliferate in the liberal city, the visibly angry mayor lashed out at the president, addressing him in the first person through TV cameras. The bursts of deadly violence erupted amid racial justice protests in Oregon and Wisconsin this past week. An acting chief of the Department of Homeland Security said that state and local leaders in the two states are standing in the way of federal law enforcement officials. Violence erupted in Kenosha last week after Jacob Blake was shot in the back by police. The mayhem that followed the usual pattern, with daytime protests devolving into nighttime looting and arson. But rage-fueled anarchy is no substitute for reform-based policy, and as violence in the streets continues, as it has in Portland, it is becoming a problem for election year Democrats. Kyle Rittenhouse did not appear for his extradition hearing as he faced charges of shooting and killing two people and injuring another in Kenosha, Wisconsin. A Republican student group of Arizona State University is receiving backlash for donating money to the 17-year-old gunman who fatally shot two protesters in Wisconsin. Defense attorneys for Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer accused of killing George Floyd, have asked a judge to dismiss the murder charges against him, arguing that Floyd's alleged drug use, not the improper use of force by the officer, was to blame for his death. President Trump will visit Kenosha, Wisconsin tomorrow following the police shooting of Jacob Blake and the subsequent deadly unrest there. Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers is urging President Trump to reconsider his plan to visit the city. President Trump also toured areas hit by Hurricane Laura in Louisiana and in Texas, receiving briefings on emergency operations and relief efforts. Speaking at a New Hampshire campaign rally, he said Democratic vice presidential candidate Kamala Harris is not competent enough to become the first female president. He instead suggested that his daughter Ivanka would be a much better fit for the role. The United States has neared 6 million coronavirus cases yesterday, nearly a quarter of the planet's total, as nations around the world battle to contain the raging pandemic. Global coronavirus infections soared past 25 million as countries tightened several restrictions to halt the health crisis that has upended life for most of humanity. India recorded over 80,000 fresh COVID-19 cases yesterday to become the first country in the world to cross the 80,000 mark in a single day since the outbreak of the pandemic. And the world's second most populous country has been posting the highest single-day caseload in the world since the 7th of August. And at 3.62 million cases, India is fast catching up to the United States and Brazil in terms of total cases, but it has a lower death rate. All over, specials honoring Black Panther star Chadwick Boseman just 2 days after the 43-year-old actor's family announced his death from colon cancer. A day earlier, the tweet from his account announcing his death and celebrating his life broke the record for most liked tweet of all time. Protesters pulled down a statue of Canada's first Prime Minister on Saturday. And top aides to President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu flew to the United Arab Emirates this morning to put the final touches on a pact establishing open relations between the Gulf power and Israel. A Star of David adorned El Al plane that took off today from Israel's Ben Gurion airport, carrying a high-ranking American and Israeli delegation to Abu Dhabi in the first ever direct commercial passenger flight to the United Arab Emirates. The Israeli airliner made this historic first flight from Tel Aviv to the UAE, emphasizing a new diplomatic tie there between the two countries, with the word peace printed in Arabic, English and Hebrew above the cockpit. It took off from Tel Aviv, bound for the UAE capital of Abu Dhabi. Several people were injured today in an explosion that was likely caused by gas lines in a restaurant in Abu Dhabi. And the United Nations voiced alarm over what it called a dramatic turn of events in Libya's civil war after a power struggle between leaders of the Tripoli-based government surfaced in the wake of anti-corruption protests. Afghanistan's president has appointed a Council for National Reconciliation, which will have final say on whether the government will sign a peace deal with the Taliban after what are expected to be protracted and uncertain negotiations with the insurgents. Sudan's transitional authorities and a rebel alliance signed a peace deal today following months of torturous negotiations aimed at ending the country's decades-long civil wars, but other powerful armed groups have thus far declined to join them. Rising floodwaters have hit Sudan's capital of Khartoum hard in recent days as weeks of heavy flooding nationwide left at least 90 people dead and destroying tens of thousands of homes. And the Saudi-led coalition allied with Yemen's government today that it foiled 2 attacks launched by Iran-backed Houthi rebels, including an explosives-laden boat dispatched into the Red Sea near international shipping lanes. A fishing boat carrying nearly 370 migrants landed overnight on the Italian island of Lampedusa, fueling anger from local officials over a recent rise in illegal arrivals. Lebanon's president called for the proclamation of a secular state during a televised address to mark the upcoming centenary of the Lebanese state. It was a century ago, on the 1st of September in 1920, that a French general stood on the porch of a Beirut palace surrounded by local politicians and religious leaders and declared the state of Greater Lebanon, the precursor of the modern state of Lebanon. The current French President Emmanuel Macron is visiting Lebanon to mark the occasion 100 years later. Not all French classrooms can safely reopen tomorrow, according to the country's education minister, as a persistent rise in coronavirus infections jeopardizes the government's push to get France's 12.9 million schoolchildren back into class this week. And tens of thousands of people demonstrated in the Belarusian capital of Minsk, continuing calls for the country's long-time authoritarian president to resign. Belarus's opposition leader will address the United Nations Security Council, and she will speak by a video link at the invitation of Estonia, which is currently a non-permanent member of the body. You're listening to the World News on Radio Caravan. And descendants of Jewish refugees expelled from Austria under Nazi rule can now apply for Austrian citizenship under a new law that goes into effect tomorrow. President Trump has called Prime Minister Shinzo Abe the greatest prime minister in Japanese history during a call between the two leaders days after the Japanese premier said he was stepping down for health reasons. And when police arrested the middle-aged Uyghur women at the height of China's coronavirus outbreak, we came to know that the government in China's far northwestern Xinjiang region is resorting to draconian measures to combat the coronavirus, including physically locking residents in homes, imposing quarantines of more than 40 days, and arresting those who do not comply. China said its troops strictly abide by the line of actual control with India, refuting the Indian Army's statement that said the Chinese armed forces had carried out provocative military actions on the southern banks of the Pangong Tso. Open-source satellite imagery captured what appears to be a heliport China is building in close proximity to 2 new air defense positions that cover sensitive stretches of the disputed border in Doklam and Sikkim sectors. India's former president Pranab Mukherjee and Bharat Ratna receiver has died today at the age of 84 after battling a long illness. Leaders and prominent people from all walks of life mourning the political stalwart Pranab Mukherjee. And the suspension of scheduled international passenger flights has been extended till the 30th of September. The addition of over 78,000 cases yesterday has taken India's COVID-19 cases past 3.6 million. India scaling another high by testing over 10.6 lakh samples in a day to detect COVID-19. Preparations are underway at a hospital in Bhubaneswar for the commencement of the second phase of human clinical trial of Covaxin, India's indigenous COVID-19 vaccine. And half of India's COVID-19 death toll load reported from 3 states yesterday: Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka. With the centre opening up more activities outside containment zones under Unlock 4.0 rules, Chief Minister Uddhav Thackeray is set to lift curbs on interstate and intrastate movement of persons and goods, raise attendance in government offices and schools, and increase occupancy limits for hotels. Union Home Minister Amit Shah was admitted to the All India Institute of Medical Sciences earlier this month for post-COVID care, has been discharged this morning. And Delhi's prisons are the most crowded and violent in the entire country. Keralites celebrated the Loki Onam amid the COVID-19 pandemic. And President Ramnath Kovind, Prime Minister Modi, Vice President Venkaiah Naidu, Kerala's Governor Arif Mohammed Khan and Chief Minister Pinarayi Vijayan were among those who extended their greetings for the harvest festival of Onam. Data from the Indian Meteorological Department shows that the country has recorded an overall excessive rains to the tune of 25% this month, a level that has not been seen in the last 44 years. A landslide and floods caused by heavy rains have killed at least 41 people in Nepal and India in the past week. And the Foreign Office in Islamabad strongly condemned recent incidents in Sweden and Norway, in which copies of the Holy Quran were reportedly burned, saying that freedom of speech can't justify religious hatred. At least 10 people arrested and several injured in violence which broke out in southern Sweden after an anti-Muslim Danish politician was blocked from attending an extremely offensive rally. And anti-Pakistan protests were held in several parts of the world as it observed International Day of Victims of Enforced Disappearances. A group of protesters gathered outside the Pakistan consulate in New York to protest the enforced disappearances in Balochistan. England captain belted a blistering half-century as England chased down a record target at the Old Trafford to beat Pakistan by 5 wickets in the second 2020 international yesterday. And the suffering of scores of Karachiites saw no end today as parts of the city remain waterlogged and without power. An agonizing 5 days after recording breaking rainfall caused widespread devastation in the metropolis. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all that I have in the news for you on this last day of August.